I love a good alibi. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fiction Technician. If you haven't been here before, my name is Jane Kalmus. I am a writer of historical cozy mysteries, and today I am talking to you about how to construct the perfect alibi for your villain in a mystery. Perfect alibi mysteries are a wonderful convention within the mystery genre, and they're a type of mystery I like to call howdunnits, because the primary question is not who done it. We lock in on the guilty party very early in this kind of story, but rather how they managed to do it while maintaining their perfect alibi. So we're going to have a lot of fun today. We're going to be looking at some episodes of Monk, which is a 2002 series that dealt with a lot of howdunnits. And by the end of it, I think you're going to see that perfect alibi mysteries are actually not that hard to construct once you have an idea of the different ways that they can come together. In our first perfect alibi mystery, TV star Brad Terry is staying over at his ex-wife's house when the paparazzi track him down. He says goodbye to his ex and agrees to answer a few questions, but in the middle of the interview,
Susan?
the camera crew rushes inside and they find Brad's ex dead, the apparent victim of an intruder. Our protagonist, Adrian Monk, quickly figures out that Brad must be the killer, but the man has a perfect alibi. He was on camera in the presence of plenty of witnesses when ex was attacked. So how did he do it? Well, it turns out that Brad's ex was an actress too, and appeared in a teen slasher flick years ago. Brad copied her scream from that movie onto an exercise tape that he knew she'd be playing as soon as he left the house. When the reporters heard her scream, they assumed she was being attacked. Brad ran inside, but not to help her, to kill her. If you watched my episode on Locked Room Murders, then you know what I'm going to call this one. This is a time-shifted murder. Let's look at the actual timeline for the crime. The alibi begins, and the press sees Brad and his ex-wife very much alive. She goes inside, and then they hear her scream. This is a false attack, a specific moment when people think the victim is being murdered, and a false attack is going to be the main thing you need in order to make a time-shifted murder work. Brad runs inside, and then the real attack begins. In the minds of the witnesses, the alibi and the attack clearly overlap, but the alibi actually only overlaps with the false attack right here in this window. The real attack doesn't begin until the alibi ends. For another kind of time shifting, let's look at an episode called Mr. Monk Goes to the Circus. In this episode, a circus ringmaster is killed by an assailant who jumps around doing all sorts of fancy gymnastic tricks. The obvious culprit is the ringmaster's ex-wife, Natasha, who is an aerialist who certainly could have done those tricks and who hated his guts. The problem is that she couldn't actually have done it. She broke her foot 2 weeks ago when she fell from a trapeze during a performance, and so this would simply be too painful for her to perform. So our previous alibi was what we're going to call a classic alibi. The character was observed somewhere else at the time of the crime, or at least what seemed to be the time of the crime. But we can think of an alibi more broadly as any circumstance that would prevent someone from committing a murder. In this case, it's not that Natasha's whereabouts were accounted for, but that she was physically incapable of committing the crime. But Monk continues to investigate, and it turns out that Natasha dressed the injury herself, so maybe she's faking? Well, the police ask her to get an x-ray, and it turns out that her foot isn't just broken, it's very broken. There's no way she could have committed the murder. Often in a howdunit, we're going to write scenes whose purpose is to specifically exclude obvious possibilities for how a crime might have taken place. That's what this scene is about, and it sort of winds the mystery up tighter and leaves the audience shaking their head and thinking, how did she do it? Well, here's how.
I've been asking if your foot was broken. I should have been asking when your foot was broken.
Natasha did fake her injury on the night of her fall. Then she murdered her ex, came back to the circus, and broke her foot by giving a trained elephant the command to stomp. So we just had a time-shifted murder. This one we're going to call a time-shifted alibi. Let's look at the graph. The false alibi begins, and during this window, the murder happens. Then the true alibi begins, and again, it seems obvious to everyone that the two time periods overlap, but they don't. The attack only overlaps the false alibi. All right, we've got lots more murders to go. In the episode, Mr. Monk and the Bad Girlfriend, Police Captain Leland Stottlemyre chats with his girlfriend Linda via webcam just a few minutes before her real estate partner is murdered across town. Monk investigates, and the more clues he uncovers, the more convinced he is that Linda is the killer. But how could she have done it? She was way across town. Monk and his assistant Natalie set off on another possibility exclusion scene, trying to determine whether Linda could have traveled the distance in time.
An hour and 5 minutes. Not even close.
They agree that she couldn't, but the clues just keep stacking up against Linda, and finally Monk figures out her secret. She rented a moving van and staged it to look like her bedroom. When she spoke to the captain via webcam, she was actually parked in a lot very near the murder site, and it was simple for her to end the call, then go murder her partner. Okay, now we've got a third alibi for our list. The murderer was physically distant from the victim. Her whereabouts during the crime aren't accounted for, but she still has an alibi because there was no way to travel the distance between her and the victim in the time allotted. This is a kind of alibi you'll often see in perfect alibi cases, where the murderer may be perceived to be in a different town or even a different country from his victim. And we're going to call this one a place-shifted alibi. It seems that the alibi is happening in location A, distant from the murder site, but in fact it's in location B, a whole lot closer. Okay, we've had time-shifted murders, time-shifted alibis, and place-shifted alibis. Can we build a perfect alibi mystery around a place-shifted murder? That is, a murder that seems to happen in one area but actually happens somewhere else. Sure, so maybe the victim could be drowned in the murderer's bathtub around 7 p.m., very close to a time when he's established a public presence at that location. Later that evening, he moves her body to her swimming pool across town. Everyone will assume she died there, and when the coroner determines that the time of her death was 7 p.m., it will be clear that the murderer has a perfect alibi because he was very far distant from her pool at 7. This sort of place-shifted murder is at the heart of the classic mystery movie Chinatown. The drowned body of Hollis Mulray is found in a reservoir, and it's assumed that he died there, but he was actually drowned in his own backyard pond. So, in this case, the place shifting doesn't establish an alibi, but what it does is change our assumptions about who could be involved in the case. When the body is found in the reservoir, we're going to assume that it's a political murder dealing with the ultra-powerful California Water Company, when what it actually is a intimate domestic crime dealing with a terrible secret at the heart of Mulray's family. So when we construct the circumstances of a crime, a lot of what we are doing is creating reader assumptions about what may have happened, some of which will probably turn out to be false. With perfect alibi murders, we're largely creating some assumptions about who did and didn't have the opportunity to commit the murder. But keep in mind that the creation and then overturning of assumptions is something you can think about more broadly when you're creating your mysteries. It doesn't have to be just about alibis. By the way, if all this is making sense to you and you feel like it's going to help you in generating mystery plots, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button, just give this video a like. That would help it go out to more viewers, and that's something that would mean an awful lot to me. Alright, our next mystery is a goodie, and it's called Mr. Monk and the Sleeping Suspect. In this mystery, a woman receives a mail bomb. She and her two brothers are in a settlement dispute over their inheritance, and so the police quickly zero in on the younger brother as the most likely suspect. Monk, however, thinks it's her older brother, but the guy's in a coma. He has been asleep for months, and the bomb was mailed only 3 days ago. However, because of a series of circumstantial clues, like the way the older brother ties his knots, Monk is convinced. Circumstantial clues like this are often how we determine the guilty party in the early part of a whodunit. The similar knots would certainly not be enough to convict anybody, but they're enough to convince Monk and his audience. Monk eventually learns how the brother did it. He used glue to stick the package to the top of a mailbox, knowing that over a couple of months that glue would degrade and the box would drop down onto the mail that was about to be delivered. Then he set about constructing his alibi. He insulted a couple of cops and peeled off, intending to be in jail when the bomb was delivered, but his plan went a little haywire. He crashed and wound up in a coma instead. This one we're going to call a time delay murder, and the graph for it looks something like this. The attack is initiated, and then the alibi begins. After some time, the attack completes, all without the murderer's direct intervention. When it comes to constructing time delay murders, you can think about substances that might degrade, like glue, ice, maybe a liquid that could evaporate. There's probably a lot of other options out there that I'm not thinking of, but keep in mind that you don't have to construct your time delay murder over the course of months, like this one with the mail bomb. It might take place over only minutes, as long as the delay is not obvious to the initial investigators. You want to create the impression that the murder was one action that the murderer had no opportunity to perform. You can also think about processes that take a while to complete, like the delivery of mail. Now, again, remember, we want to hide that delay. So this won't work if the mail is perceived to be the agent of death, as in the case with the mailbox. However, it totally works in an episode called Mr. Monk and the Astronaut. In this episode, an astronaut drugs his girlfriend, and attaches her to a garage door opener by a noose. Then he mails her garage door opener, knowing that when it arrives, she will be throttled. It's good timing for him because by then, he'll actually be up in space.
Now maybe we should take a minute and see if we can think of a better alibi.
Time delay murders are similar to, but a little bit different from the murder we're going to talk about in our next case, and that's Mr. Monk is on the air. In this one, a morning shock jock is at work when the gas valve is turned on in his bedroom, poisoning his sleeping wife. The coroner determines the time of death, and it's clear that the DJ was on the air when it happened. Okay, so how did he do it? Well, over the last month, he's been pet sitting his neighbor's dog, who he trained to turn off a gas valve at a specific voice command. In this case, a catchphrase he was using on the radio, "Jiggle me timbers." All he had to do was make certain the radio was on where the dog could hear it, and then he could go to work and do his routine. The dog would handle the rest. We're going to call this one remote control murder. The murderer creates a set of circumstances that will result in someone's death, then triggers those circumstances from afar. Let's talk about a case called Mr. Monk and the Genius. A woman comes to Monk terrified, convinced that her husband, a renowned chess grandmaster, is going to kill her. In fact, he's told her that he's going to kill her and that there's nothing she'll be able to do to stop him. Well, one day while he's away at a tournament, she dies, seemingly of a heart attack. There are no signs of trauma on the body, and the housekeeper said that the victim hadn't eaten all day, so poison doesn't seem like a likely option. How did he do it? Well, it turns out that terrorizing his wife by telling her he planned to kill her was actually part of the plan. She was a recovering alcoholic, and his threats caused her to fall off the wagon and begin drinking again in secret. And because she was ashamed of her drinking, she hid her alcohol. All he had to do was find her hiding place, poison her liquor, and then leave to construct the perfect alibi, knowing that his wife had been driven to the breaking point and that she would try to calm herself with a drink, then hide the bottle for him somewhere not too obvious where the police wouldn't think to look for it. He'd return home and be at leisure to dispose of the bottle when the coast was clear. This is a murder type we're going to call traps, and this is a very elegantly constructed trap because the victim is actually going to hide the evidence for the murderer. Just like we talked about hiding the delay in a time delay murder, in this kind of crime we want to hide any evidence that there was any sort of trap at all. So you might think about ways to trap items that victims would naturally discard, like a Kleenex, a water bottle, or items that the victim might naturally travel away from before dying. For example, maybe your victim always goes out for a daily morning run. Well, you might trap her usual water fountain just before she gets there. She drinks, runs off, and dies minutes later with no clear method of murder in sight. Okay, our very last type of murder is from an episode called Mr. Monk and the Lady Next Door. In this episode, Mr. Monk befriends a woman who keeps coming down to the police station to complain about her neighbor who plays his drum set loudly at all hours. When a murder is committed, Mr. Monk thinks that his new friend's neighbor is the culprit, but she insists he was playing the drum at the very same time as the murder. So one obvious possibility is that Monk's friend and her neighbor are in on it together, and we have another exclusion scene in which we deal with this possibility. And this one has a big emotional impact because Monk accuses his friend of being the murderer's accomplice, destroying the bond they were forming, which was already becoming very important to him. So this is definitely something to watch for in your planning process. Scenes where you can both advance the exploration of the case while also putting your characters in an emotional squeeze. Anytime you can make the scenes that bring together your mystery dovetail with the scenes that are part of your character's story arc so nicely, you know you've latched onto something really good. Well, it turns out that Monk's friend is innocent. Her neighbor used an anatomic robot stolen from a museum to convince her that he was there on the night of the murder. This is a decoy alibi, and the graph for it looks like this. A real alibi is established, and then at some point the murderer leaves a decoy in his place so that he can go commit the murder. The decoy doesn't have to be a physical figure like in this case. This is also an alibi type used in Mr. Monk and the Marathon Man. In this mystery, a runner in a marathon murders his mistress, but all the runners were wearing electronic chips to check their arrival at the checkpoints along the course, and this runner never missed a checkpoint, so what happened? Well, he attached his chip to a TV camera bike that was filming the marathon using a magnetic hide-a-key. He started the race, then ducked out after a few miles and went to kill his mistress. Near the end of the race, he rejoins it so that any footage of the finish line will show him finishing the race. In this case, it's the bike that was our decoy, but the pattern is still the same. The killer establishes a true alibi, switches to the decoy alibi, and then returns to their true alibi once the deed is done. Well, I hope you've got your fill of how done it's over the last few videos and that you're ready to go write some. I have had so much fun breaking down these episodes of Monk, and if there are any classic mystery plot twists or shows that you love, be sure to let me know below in the comments because I just love breaking them down for you. Check out!